Nelson. I'm the Information and Communication Manager for Mesa County Public Health, so thank you for, did that sound really rehearsed? Thank you for coming today, we appreciate it. Emily Shockley is the PIO for School District 51. So we are not giving the presentation today. We have our experts here. So Dana Wiesman is with Mesa County Public Health. She's a health promotion specialist who's dedicated to suicide prevention. And Jen Morris is a suicide prevention specialist with D51. So they're the experts. They'll be presenting to you. And yeah, thanks for coming. So one of the things I wanted to talk about before we get started here are your clickers. So it's a polling device. It's completely anonymous. Not that we're going to ask you any hard questions or anything, but...
And there are only 5 of you, so it'll be pretty easy to figure out who's who.
Yeah, right. So rate your knowledge on safe suicide reporting, and the number correlates with your answer. So if you would take a moment to click your answer. Don't look at me. No cheating. All right. Good and fair. Okay, that's good. So at the end, we'll do this poll one more time, and hopefully everybody will be like,
excellent.
Hey! But we'll see. We have some good stuff planned for you. So again, we've got Dana and Jen, and I'm going to hand it over to them.
Hello, and thank you for being here. So Mesa County has been working with, sorry, I'm really nervous. So I'm going to try to get past that. Okay, so Mesa County's been working with local agencies and organizations, 5 other Colorado counties, the Office of Suicide Prevention, the CDC, and other national partners to reduce suicide statewide by 20% by 2025. That's a huge goal. We need your help to get there. Increasing awareness and education, encouraging social engagement, reducing access to lethal means, providing effective aftercare, promoting economic stability, and increasing access to and delivery of care are a few of the initiatives that we are working on. Reducing suicide in our community is everyone's responsibility, and the media plays an integral role in keeping our most vulnerable citizens safe. By promoting prevention initiatives and reporting safely on high-profile celebrity suicides and the occasional local suicide, you can prevent suicide contagion. Jen is going to talk about contagion.
Yeah, will you take us to the next? Sure thing, just let me know when. Oh, so here are our goals.
Oh, goals. Oh, yeah, we already did.
You spoke to these. Sorry.
I'll give you a moment.
I was behind
Just
on clicking.
Okay. So when we talk about suicide contagion, what we're really talking about is behaviors spreading. And suicidal behaviors spread, and suicide spreads, but also all of our behaviors spread. So to think about contagion, I think about all of our typical behaviors, or maybe some of our non-typical behaviors. Maybe some of you guys have had the experience of having a coworker come in with a piercing or a tattoo or a really radical hairdo, and you're like, oh, yes, maybe I could pull that off, right? And you start thinking about it, maybe, maybe not. That is this idea of behavior spreading through our networks, right? We experience things, we think about them, maybe we try them on ourselves, maybe we don't, depending on a whole lot of different circumstances and what that decision is. Suicide contagion is that same thought, right? That same thing. It is a behavior spreading through our social network. And media has an integral part in that, right? Not just fashion trends, but also in our safety. So with suicide contagion, it's essentially the exposure to suicide or suicide behaviors, and that can happen in a lot of ways. It can happen through media, it can happen through our culture, it can happen within our family or within our peer group. And those things, having that exposure can increase somebody's risk to thinking suicidal thoughts or acting on suicidal thoughts, especially for those folks who are already at an increased risk of suicide, which is why this training is so important for media. right, to report safely. In a moment, we're going to discuss some general and specific things to do in terms of safety so that we can not contribute to suicidal behavior spreading throughout our community. Dana's going to speak to that.
So what is safe reporting? Safe reporting is a choice. Every time you do some media reporting on suicide, you are making a choice to do safe reporting. It's your choice to keep the community safe. It's your obligation to keep our community and the most vulnerable citizens safe. Choosing to abandon sensationalism, that's critical. We don't want to sensationalize suicide. We want to shift the narrative to a positive perspective. We want to give people hope. We have recommendations for suicide reporting. Using those and applying those to your reporting is critical. The messages that media conveys about suicide and suicide prevention impact public perceptions and the problem and the available solutions. So we need to give people solutions to the problem. We need to shift the perspective to a positive narrative, and we need to give them solutions. So 4 of the key factors. When you're building your report, you want to think about your strategy. What message are you trying to get across? You want to think about that safety messaging. What are the do's? What are the don'ts? You're going to look at your guidelines and make sure that you're following those guidelines and making sure that you're shifting that narrative to a positive narrative.
So we'll break each of these down a little bit further. Let's start with strategy. So strategy really refers to the overall context of your story. And just like Dana said, stepping away from that sensationalism, because that can contribute to this idea that it's out of control or that there's nothing that we can do about it. When the fact is that by choosing to report responsibly, you're contributing to the solution. So the strategy is that overall context in looking at highlighting those positive aspects of somebody's life, asking yourself, why are you reporting on this, is a fabulous place to just start, right? Is this something that you're sometimes in poor reporting that some of us have seen throughout our community and the nation, it happens. There are things that get reported that people wouldn't report on except that that person died by suicide, right? That's the only reason that they are reporting this, which just contributes to that sensationalism. So really stepping back and asking, why am I reporting this? What is important about this? And then looking at the whole context of it, right? Our deaths are a very small part of our lives. It's just a sliver, a small part of time. Really, the rest of the context is throughout somebody's life. So looking at those pieces of contributions and attributes. Looking at who you want to reach and what action do you want your audience to take. With sensationalist pieces, audience members are oftentimes left feeling fearful or maybe panicked. We want to call to action in a positive direction that works to decrease suicide and suicide behaviors, and just like Dana said, letting people know what our resources are and where to go. So really thinking about the whole broad context of your story. What's the message?
So some safe messaging. These are the things we want you to avoid. Avoid showing videos or photos of the method or location. Avoid framing suicide in terms of successes. Successfully completed suicide, not appropriate. So committed suicide. Think about times when you would use the word committed. They committed a crime. They committed a sin. Suicide is neither one. So committed isn't appropriate. Do say died by suicide. That's really the most appropriate term to use, died by suicide. Avoid romanticizing the death. Avoid describing suicide rates as skyrocketing or as an epidemic or other strong terms. We see that a lot in media reporting in Mesa County because we do have high rates of suicide here. But we would like to step away from that and just kind of minimize our numbers so to avoid giving people the wrong perception. avoid publishing text from a suicide note, avoid quoting police or first responders, avoid describing suicide as inexplicable or without warning. We know that in most cases there are warnings, so to say that there weren't any warnings is usually not best practice. Yeah.
About the avoid describing suicide rates as skyrocketing or an epidemic, how do you suggest describing high rates of suicide then?
Well, certainly I think you could say that there's been an increase, and really just looking at what the facts are. So the issue with skyrocketing or epidemic is that it's sensational language. It doesn't give you a black and white, irrefutable fact, and it gives that feeling of like, oh my goodness, this is out of control, right? Which can leave vulnerable people feeling like, well, it's just the way it is then, right? So it's just really important to step away from that language that evokes that real strong feeling. And if rates are increasing, then state, yeah, they're increasing, but not skyrocketing. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about romanticizing the death? I guess I'm not really sure what you mean completely. Can you give an example?
So celebrity suicides, we romanticize those pretty frequently. I don't really know the best way to describe romanticizing.
So I think that sometimes what can happen in reporting is it can lead to, or in any storytelling, I think if anybody has seen, and this isn't a news media specific example, but if anybody's familiar with 13 Reasons Why, that's a fabulous example of romanticizing, right? So it tells this really engaging story, again, that is not focused on the person's contributions, their strengths, and their struggles, but it's focusing on what they felt was the only choice in that moment, and then it's blowing that up, and that is the story, versus that was not the person's life, right? That was their death, which is this much, and if we're looking at it from a time perspective. So that's not the life that they walked or lived or how they contributed. Yeah,
that's helpful. Thank you.
And we really want to promote prevention efforts in Mesa County. And so anytime that we're romanticizing suicide or using those extreme examples, that really limits our conversation about prevention efforts in Mesa County. There's been a lot of work done here, and we have made a pretty significant impact. So promoting that is important. So we have things to include. Include links to treatment services. So anytime you talk about service or talk about suicide, talk about or write an article about suicide, include links for the suicide hotline. I've given you a list of, I will give you a list of resources that provides all that information for you. Include stories of hope. For people that might be considering suicide, those stories of hope, there is light at the end of the tunnel, you will get through this, that's important. Comment sections, this is a difficult one. I know on social media, this is a difficult one to manage, but if you have the opportunity to monitor those social media posts, we encourage that. We see a lot of negative impacts of those social media posts.
and sometimes just plain bullying.
Yeah, exactly. Contact an expert to get the facts. And if you're having trouble finding your story without romanticizing or creating a extreme story about suicide, call us. One of us can help you find that story. We have a lot of ideas. And report suicide as a health issue. This is a public health issue in Mesa County. It's recognized as that, so report on that. We have a clicker poll, which is good. So use choose the headline that best utilizes safe reporting guidelines. Chester Bennington, you may all know who that is. He was the lead singer for Linkin Park. He did die by suicide. Chester Bennington, Linkin Park singer, is dead at 41. B, Chester Bennington death. Read the Linkin Park singer's emotional farewell letter to Chris Cornell. C, Linkin Park's Chester Bennington, a Phoenix native, dies of apparent suicide. And D, Linkin Park's Chester Bennington commits suicide. Choose the best Safe reporting answer.
Just waiting on one more. Heidi, do you want a clicker?
No.
Oh,
I thought for a second.
yeah. Can we try that one more time? Can you select on the clicker?
Having them vote again?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And we're waiting on one more.
Okay.
There it is.
There we go.
Jody's caught up.
Okay. There we go.
And A was the correct answer. So good job.
Yeah, so again, D has the word commits in it, and that's a word that we shy away from. We know that the language that we use, it matters. And it's easy to get tied up in the weeds around specific words. I shy away from the word contagion because, again, I think it contributes to this idea of something being out of control or beyond our control, when in fact there are very real things that we can do for it. And so just as Dana said, commits, when we talk about commits, we are typically talking about a sin, or people being committed to a mental institution, or somebody committing a crime. And suicide is none of those things. So it's one of the ways we can destigmatize mental health, by choosing to not use commits. Oh, positive narrative. So reframing our message. We talked about what safe messaging is, things to avoid, things to include, looking at the context and strategy for the story. When we look at the positive narrative, now, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's guilty of this in my personal life. When you have a problem, I was maybe even guilty of this last night. When you have a problem with something and you go to your friend or your spouse and you tell them the story about the problem, as humans, we tend to lament in that problem for a little while. Again, I hope I'm not alone in that. Right? You just need to get it all out, barf out all the issues, complain about it, kind of dump everything out. And we tend to spend the majority of our time in that space for a period of time. Now, you can't solve problems in that space, right? You have to figure out, you have to kind of, for me, I have to get that out of my system before then I can come back to it objectively. So this is like the 80-20 rule. When we're complaining about something, when we're struggling with something, we tend to speak about the problem of it 80% of the time, and then look at the solution 20% of the time, but that's not productive. So we really want to flip that narrative so that we are looking at what's positive, at what contributes to helping 80% of the time. And when you think about it, once you've solved a problem, you're able to do that. You're able to look back objectively and say, oh yeah, I did this, that, and the other. And so with suicide, we want to bring a similar frame to it, in that we are really focusing on the positive narrative. The death may be a very small part of a story, but it is a small part of a story. It is not the person's life. It is not what they contributed. It was not their strengths. And really highlighting those things. And I would challenge you to see if you can utilize that 80-20 rule. Can we spend 80% of the story on this positive attributes, what helps, and then that smaller piece on the death, if it's necessary. Another thing to avoid is contributing to stigma. So there are groups that are more at risk of suicide because they are more vulnerable. I'm thinking of the LGBTQ+ community comes to mind, or veterans. There are various reasons that contribute to that. Suicide is a complex issue. What we don't want to do is say everybody who does this, or everybody who belongs to X group is going to think about suicide, is going to die by suicide. And sensationalistic headlines can contribute to that, right? So somebody who is vulnerable, who identifies with that group, can then feel like, oh, well, here's my story, so this is my answer. And we don't want to do that. So that's where we go to the positive narrative of, again, highlighting what those strengths are, highlighting what individuals and institutions are doing to help combat stigma, and what are the resources that are available. All right, another clicker.
Yay!
Activity.
So this is about your B-roll, the picture that you're going to put with your report. Choose the best front page photo for your story. Can everybody see it clearly? one more. Oh, there we go.
There we go. All right.
Yay! So B. B is the healthiest, safest, most appropriate choice. One of the things that I did want to take an opportunity to discuss is this picture of D here where we have presumed friends or just acquaintances of Chester Bennington and their reactions to his death. And what I want to caution you on is it's really important to remember that when somebody has lost someone else, that can be a shocking experience, especially if that person has died by suicide. That person is grieving. They are also extremely vulnerable emotionally. They are probably not accurate reporters of fact because that part of their brain just is not working when we're in that space. And another thing to remember is they may say things that they may later on regret, right? And it's important to, I guess, approach that with that knowledge, right? So if you choose to interview somebody who's a grieved loved one, they may not be factual, and they may say something in the heat of the moment that they later regret saying. Again, no one else is guilty of that, of saying something in the heat of the moment that they later wish they could take back, right? And a death by suicide is just a more extreme version of that moment, right, for somebody emotionally. So it's important to have recognition and appreciation of that.
I feel like C is really interesting because once someone is dead, HIPAA no longer applies to them. So I think that that's something really interesting as a reporter. Technically, it's not against the law. You know, you're outside on public space and you're not violating someone who's living. You're not violating their rights. But I mean, think about if that was your family member in that body bag type thing. And the journalism side of me is like, well, it's not against the rules technically. So that one is really interesting for me.
Yeah. Any questions on that? Okay. So the guidelines. Basically, this is just a recap of what we've talked about. We want you to think about your strategy. We want you to put those safety plans in place, those safety recommendations in place, and we want you to think about shifting that narrative to a positive one. I will provide you with those recommendations. There's a list of online resources. Always think about what your objective is when writing this story. Who do you want to be reaching and what message do you want to be sending? You play a huge role. You play a huge role in protecting our community members. So utilize that and shift that narrative. Be the positive voice. I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, we have some examples.
We've got, yeah.
So some bad reporting, things that make us in the field go, ah. And what to do instead.
These are all examples that, well, the top one is an example that we did take off the internet. So that was a headline, Kurt Cobain used shotgun to commit suicide. We don't know what the objective of that article was. Stating the facts, just state the facts. He's dead. Photos, videos of location, describing suicides as an epidemic skyrocketing, just kind of a recap of what we've already talked about. You can go to the CDC, not the DCD, the CDC and get current information. You can call public health, you can contact me, and I can give you information as well. So just have your facts, get your data, and yeah, shift that positive, shift that narrative to positive.
So I think we have an exercise.
We do.
Yes. Yeah. I think Dana has some, yeah.
So we're going to have you write a headline.
So there are two stories, one on the front and one on the back.
So go ahead and just read through the story on the first scenario. Yeah, thank you.
2 or 1?
You can do 2. Scenario 2, if you'd like.
Oh, yeah. Well,
No, good.
No extra work for me.
There's a lot of information there. There's a lot of content that you have to extrapolate from. And there's a lot of content in there that really isn't necessary for the public to know. So when writing your headline, remember your strategy, remember your safety do's and don'ts, and find that positive narrative. What are some ideas about what that positive narrative might be? You guys have any ideas? Thoughts? What do we know about what this person did for a living?
He was a successful business owner.
Mm-hmm. So do you think there might be some positive narrative there?
Say it again.
That's what I put.
Yeah.
Would you like to share your headlines?
No, I just put local prominent Kenny business owner John Smith dead at 52 is all right.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that would be a catchy headline. It gives us the information that we need to want to continue reading that article. And then inside that article, you can shift that narrative to a positive by highlighting his career as a local prominent candy maker, right? Any other thoughts? Any other ideas? What is some information there that may not be relevant or may not be important to report on?
Yeah. It's, and one of the reasons that we discourage listing specific modes or means is as soon as somebody says it, we picture it, right? So for somebody who's already thinking about suicide or struggling with those thoughts, you know, they may be fighting it and we just went, here. So again, that's a reason to not post those things. Yeah, absolutely.
Ever closer here to 1 o'clock, so thanks for being here. I know that you're all super busy all the time and probably have to head right back to work for a story or something. So we really appreciate your time, and if you have any questions, let us know. We're happy to be your resource. And thank you to our
And if you want to come
trainers.
back to the next one, I won't be nearly as nervous, I promise. And I'll actually be able to convey what I want to say.
You did great. There was a lot of good info.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you.
Thank you.